Hello, everyone. I'm Emily. I'm your host for today. If it's your first time at Big Questions, you're very welcome. And if you've come since, you've been in Cambridge, that's great too. Big Questions is basically a chance to ask, discuss, and investigate the big questions about life and its meaning and the claims of Jesus. Our title for today is This Is Me, Are We Really Free to Be Ourselves? This is a very deep but also a very personal question. And for that, we are very grateful to have Ellie Cook, who's come to speak to us today. Ellie, do you want to come up? Ellie works with Christian students up in Durham, and so she's come all the way here to speak to us, which is really great. And so now I just pass this over to Ellie. Thanks.
Lovely. Is that working? Yes, super. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is my first ever visit to Cambridge, and I haven't seen very much of it yet, but it seems nice, so lucky you. Yes, so our question today is, are we really free to be ourselves? And I think it's a really important question for you guys to be thinking about as students. At university is a time of incredible opportunity to ask some of the big questions of life and kind of questions about who we'll be. But it's also a time of incredible change. It has been a minute or two since I was an undergraduate, but I do remember it. And one specific thing I remember is how much I changed during that time. The experiences I had, the people who I met, the books I read, the things I learned, all served to shape who I was in fairly significant ways. And I expect that you'll find that the same is true. For those of you who've been here for a little while, you'll recognise some of that reality in yourself. But for those of you who are new to Cambridge and new to this part of your life, there are questions to be asked about who you're going to be. Who are you going to become? How are you going to present yourself to the people that you meet? And particularly in these kind of early weeks where people don't really know you yet, you have the opportunity, I suppose, to reinvent yourself, don't you? Perhaps to choose a new identity. But that can also be quite unsettling. When we place our identity and value in our relationships in particular, it can be strange to be in a place where those don't exist yet, can't it? In a world of opportunity, in a new place with so many new opportunities, who will we be and how do we know who we are? As we begin, I think it's helpful to briefly define our terms. What do we mean by identity? Since I'm in Cambridge, I consulted the Cambridge Dictionary, your very own dictionary. Basically, this is how they define identity, who a person is, or the qualities of a person or group that make them different from others. It's who we are, and it's how we're different. And that's a really helpful summary, as it captures huge parts of how our identities work. In some ways, we'll talk about our identity in terms of things that are true about us, things that we like, skills we have, where we're from, what we hope for in the future. But often we'll also talk and think about our identity in terms of things that aren't true of us, how we're different, what sets us apart from everyone else, things we don't like or won't do. And both of those are important in different ways and at different points in life. And I think that our question for today may feel like it's more bound up in the latter definition. There's an implication in the question, can we be ourselves, isn't there? The idea is that we're all different from one another, but we might be tempted to hide that reality from the rest of the world. Perhaps you feel like an outsider, but you don't want to be, so you do your best to fit in with those around you. Or perhaps you're doing really well at being part of the crowd, but you long to stand up and stand out, for people to know the real you. Authenticity is a big deal in our culture. We want to know people, to trust them, to feel like they're showing us their true selves. And I suppose we want to do that for others as well, don't we? But that causes us to ask another question. Can we even know ourselves? It's all very well asking, am I free to be me? But what if I don't really know who me is? Now, psychologists will sometimes talk about identity in terms of narrative. Essentially, we define our identity in a series of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I think that's an increasingly common and popular way to consider identity. If I were to ask you the question, what's your story? you would understand that to mean that I was asking you to tell me about yourself, but more than just what college you're part of, where you went to school, and what your favourite ice cream flavour is. What I'm asking you with that question is something much deeper. What people, places, and experiences have turned you into the person that you are today? What do you really care about? Who are you? What makes you you? There's a recognition that our identity is bound up in all sorts of things related to how we've lived, how we live now, and how we hope to live in the future. And it's important to work out the answer to these questions of identity. And traditionally, humans have done that in a couple of different ways. Firstly, we look out. So we have initially what sociologists and anthropologists refer to as ascribed status. Who you are is bound up in your race, nationality, social group, your status, your gender, your age, etc. And those things, what the society around you says is true about you because of those things. And this is particularly important in more traditional societies. So a few hundred years ago here in the UK, you or I would have just been the job that our parents did. We'd have just done what they did. So if your dad was a farmer or a teacher or a miner, then you would have been a farmer or a teacher or a miner. If you were a girl, you would have not had a job, because that would have been your kind of status and your as part of your gender. If you were born in a particular town or city, then you would have likely stayed in that town or city for the rest of your life. It would be unthinkable for us to try and work out who we are and could be outside of the life that we were born into. And perhaps that's still true for some of us here from different nationalities or even in British families with a kind of long and committed heritage. The cards we've been dealt in life dictate who we are. And to find that deeper sense of self, we need to pay attention to them. But let's put this under the microscope for a little while, shall we? This assigned identity is and was a lot more durable. People had a lot more focus and clarity, perhaps a lot less anxiety as well, fewer decisions to make, you just do what you do. But there are also some significant problems. It's fine if you're one of the privileged few, but what if you don't want to be what's been dealt to you? What about when the position of privilege doesn't work? What about when our nationalism leads us to exclude others? We see, don't we, the beauty of the civil rights movement in America was born out of a refusal to accept the norm and the ascribed status that have been in existence for years. So we see that ascribed status can't have all of the answers, but what other options do we have? Well, I guess the traditional alternative to ascribed status is achieved status. I am what I achieve. In the words of Batman, it's not who we are underneath, but what we do that defines us. Who will I be? Well, I'll be what I make of myself. You work hard, you achieve, and no one can take it away from you. And I assume that's how many of you got here to Cambridge. You worked hard and you achieved, and so you embrace that as your identity. And again, we can recognise some good in that, can't we? There's a right and healthy sense in which we should take pride in our achievements. But I think we also recognise some of the problems. What if, in reality, for most of us, our achievements are just kind of average? Perhaps you've found that as you've come to university, you were the clever one when you were at school, and now you've come to a university full of people who were the clever ones when they were at school, and you're just a bit more ordinary. What if you don't make it to the top of your field or your career? And even if you do, you can't stay that forever, can you? If who you are is what you achieve, then you're only as good as your latest achievement. And you need to keep achieving and keep achieving and keep achieving. And that can be exhausting. Some of us know that, don't we? Whether it's pressure to achieve from ourselves or from a parent or something else, we feel the kind of exhaustion of keeping that going. And what about when life comes in and we can no longer do what makes us who we are? Whether we get old or something happens that stops us from being able to achieve what we have always done, where are we then? And of course, the truth is that for most of us, the things that we do in a few years or a few generations will be forgotten. And so it was as if we never even bothered in the first place. And maybe we don't feel our achievements define us, but I ask you to just consider, what would you do if they were taken away? How would you have felt on results day if you hadn't got the grades, if you were sitting at home while all of your friends went off to university. Of course we look to our achievements. They are important and significant to us. So we can also look outside of ourselves to find who we are in other people's approval. What do people think of me? Do they like me? This is put on steroids when we come to university, isn't it? What does that person on my corridor think of me? What does my tutor think of me? What does that person I fancy think of me? Who will I be? Will I be the funny one, or the clever one, or the relaxed one, or the posh one, or the connected one, or the working class one, or the one who doesn't care about what other people think, but actually really does? And it leaves us constantly asking, am I enough? Am I funny enough? Am I clever enough? Am I connected enough? And perhaps we think that doesn't really matter, that we can step away from the chasing of acclaim so long as those who we love think of us well and think of us as good. As long as a few key people love me, that's who I am. And absolutely that is a beautiful thing. To love and be loved in return is brilliant, but many of us will know the crush of losing that love, whether that's through death or loss or relationship breakdown. And if who we are is dependent on the love we receive, and the love we receive is always going to be dependent on our actions, then that's a flimsy love, isn't it? What about when people see the worst of us? When we're having to constantly present the best version of ourselves and hide the bad bits, even from those who we love and trust, for fear that they'll reject us. So looking out has its benefits, the ascribed status, the achieved status, the approval of others. But there are also some real pitfalls that we've seen. So maybe the solution is, don't look out, look in. And that would be, I suppose, the particular kind of emphasis over the last several years, this kind of idea of self-esteem. If the esteem of others goes up and down, then the only sure footing is to esteem oneself, to ignore all the voices from outside and find out who I am and what I think of myself. It's all over our Instagram. It's in all of the self-help sections of the bookshops. How to love yourself, how to listen to the only voice that matters, yours. And of course, having a healthy view of ourselves is a good thing. And it makes sense at a surface level, doesn't it? It sounds good, but what about when life gets hard? What if I look and the me inside is filled with doubt and fear? It might work temporarily, but what about when life gets hard? When life gets hard, I'm on my own. And also, the requirement of this is to be honest about ourselves, isn't it? And that's a good thing, of course there is. And hopefully if we are honest, we can get over the awkwardness of saying nice things about ourselves out loud, then we're able to admit that there's something good in each of us, some real potential or greatness. And I hope that each of us can see that as we look at ourselves, we can see the good things, and we can say, yeah, I love that about myself, I'm good at that. But as we're honest with ourselves and we're honest about the good that we see, we have to be consistent. We also have to recognise where we're not so great, where there's potential for bad things as well. We think about the times when we're kind or brave, and we can't help thinking about the times when we've been unkind or cowardly, selfish, dishonest, vengeful, jealous. Finding our identity and being true to ourselves isn't always great advice. What if being true to myself means punching everyone in the face who I find irritating? I mean, it might be fine for me, but you wouldn't enjoy it. And I guess we start to see some of that, don't we, as we look at ourselves. We like some of who we are, but then the cracks and the splinters that spread across us demonstrate to us that not all of what we see is good, and not all of who we are is good. So, if finding out who we are and who we'll be from looking out to our ascribed status in life, our achievements, the approval of others, or looking to our own hearts has serious problems, is there any alternative? What if I discover something about myself that I don't like? Can I even change it? Now, the moral flaws that we see in ourselves is what Christians would refer to when they use the word sin. Not just doing bad things, but the kind of the worst impulses in us that splinter and crack through all parts of our life. Reactions, motivations, and relationships. And it can be easy to look critically at others, to see violence and corruption and selfishness in the lives and actions of others, But we also recognise that once we spend any time considering our own hearts, that we are also not immune from that. The corruption of the world, sin, is something that we experience and that we perpetrate. It's the biggest problem that we're facing, and it has a huge effect on our identity. We've seen that play out as we looked at all of the different approaches to defining our identity and seen their problems, haven't we? The oppression that comes with ascribed status, the degradation of achieved status, the loss and grief and selfishness that can be bound up in seeking approval of others, and the bleak view of ourselves when we look within. And as we draw to an end, I'd like just to look at a story from John's Gospel. They're on your tables. They look like this. Basically, if you're not familiar with it, this is a kind of a biography of Jesus' life. It's part of the Bible. And I suppose one thing to recognise as we look at it is that the Bible's view on identity is that we are created by God, and therefore he is the one who tells us who we are and gives us our identity. And that's significant as we come to look at this. We don't have time to read the story, but what I'm looking at is a story that you can find on page 8, and I'd love to encourage you to, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, but I'd love to encourage you to take this away with you, read it for yourself at a later date, see whether what I said made sense. So basically, in this story, we basically are told about an encounter between Jesus and a Samaritan woman who he meets at a well. The woman is part of a different kind of sect, tribe from Jesus. She is a woman, and those kind of things mean that it's odd in some ways that Jesus is having an interaction with her. We see that as we kind of get into the story. It's hot, it's the middle of the day. Jesus asks her for water because they're by a well. They enter into a conversation with one another. They talk about worship and truth and living water, this concept that Jesus introduces her to. And he basically reveals, as he has this conversation, that he knows everything about her. He knows who she is. He knows her identity. And in the end, the conversation, this encounter with Jesus, transforms her life. And not just her life, but the lives of everybody who she knows. A whole village is transformed by this encounter that she has. And as we meet this woman, we learn quite a bit about her. We learn about her identity somewhat in the eyes of herself, but also in the eyes of people around her, of her neighbours. And particularly, the thing that's significant about her as we meet her is her relationship status. In the culture that they're part of, the way that who she is and her relationship status is considered scandalous. And it basically means that she's been ostracised from her community. Her identity is what that society, I suppose, but ours as well, might cruelly and misogynistically label as damaged goods. She'd been married 5 times. She's now living with a 6th man who isn't her husband. And we don't know what's happened to the men that she'd been married to. Perhaps some of them had died, but most likely at least some of them have left her. Have they mistreated her? We don't know. Have they thrown her out? Have they replaced her with someone younger or more beautiful? Whatever has happened to her, she's clearly been left at a point where she's either so disillusioned by relationships that she's kind of given up on marriage altogether, or she's seen by society as so valueless that she's had to resort to moving in with whomever would have her in order to survive, because that's how the culture worked. But whichever is true, she's struggling, and in a way that we can probably understand, even if we can't totally identify with everything she's gone through. Her own actions and the actions of others and the perception of the society around her have all impacted her identity and mean that she's been ostracised and rejected. And then she meets Jesus, and they have a really weird conversation about water. Here they are at the hottest part of the day, out in the baking sun, where she has come to do the exhausting but necessary job of collecting water for the day, and Jesus offers her something that sounds too good to be true. Water that once drunk will mean she'll never be thirsty again. Now, of course, she's intrigued. And yet, as the conversation unfolds, it becomes clear that Jesus is talking about something other than just water. He's talking about true satisfaction, true identity and meaning, and something that will never run out or disappoint or fail. The problem for the woman, for us as well, is that we try to put our ultimate hopes for love and satisfaction and happiness and identity and status and meaning and worth in things that can't ever really do it. It might not feel like it, but when we try to find our identity in our achievements or our relationships or ourselves, we're putting the people or the things or ourselves in the place that can and should only ever be filled by God. We were made by God, and he's the only one who can tell us who we really are and how we're meant to live. We were made to find ultimate meaning and happiness and love in God, and when we try to look for it elsewhere, not only does it not work, but it damages us. It's like trying to quench our thirst with salt water. It doesn't work. It won't work. It just makes us thirstier and sick and sends us mad and eventually kills us. To try and put something, anything, anyone in the place that should by rights belong to God means that we're not just rejecting him, but also the life that only he can give us. And because he's the only one who can give us life, he's the only one who can really help us out of this situation of betrayal and rejection, this sin that we've already spoken about. And how does he do it? Well, the answer comes later in the story. So as you do take these Gospels and keep reading them, you'll see that for yourself. But allow me now to give you a couple of spoilers. This Jesus, who talks to the woman by the well, is put to death. This Jesus, who is God, this Jesus who is the only one who can offer the woman what she really needs, this Jesus who offered her water that would mean she would never be thirsty again, this Jesus does something that shows us how truly serious and devastating our sin is, and offers to take the consequences that we deserve on his own shoulders. I mentioned earlier about how although we want people to know us, we're often frightened by the idea of someone really knowing us. We know what our hearts are really like, and we're afraid of what might happen if they knew. We're afraid of being rejected, of being turned away. And I'm sure this woman was too, and yet it turns out that Jesus already knew. He knew her secrets, her dashed hopes, her regret, and her shame. But despite it all, he doesn't mock her or turn away or reject her. He speaks to her, he treats her kindly, and ultimately he takes all of her secrets and disappointments and regrets and shame on his shoulders, and he dies in her place. And ours too, if we'll trust him with it all. Our struggle with our identity is when we see our flaws, when we notice the things that we dislike about ourselves or that others dislike about us, and we don't know what to do with them. We want to know ourselves. We want to be comfortable with ourselves. We want to change ourselves, but we can't. And yet, what Jesus offers this woman is something that he offers us too. He sees who we really are, and he offers to change us and transform us in the best ways. To make us like him, not by giving us new things to achieve or self-esteem techniques, but by forgiving us and welcoming us into a relationship with him. One who will never disappoint with us or abandon us, and one who we can't and don't want to hide from. Perhaps this all seems ludicrous. I'm sure you have lots of questions and concerns, but for a moment, if you will, suspend your disbelief and consider what it might look like to believe this and live in light of it. What would it feel like and mean for you to have a fresh start, to be forgiven, to be accepted by the one who knows you at your worst, but gave his life to achieve your acceptance and will never turn you away? And with this ultimate sense of identity in place, be free to enjoy and appreciate the achievements that you have and the approval of others in a way that doesn't crush us when we lose it. If that does sound appealing, then I'd love to invite you to do a bit of investigating. If what I've said sounds like something that you'd like to be true, then why not look into the evidence and find out whether it is? The Christian Union exists to help you to do that. That's why they put on events like this. They want you to ask these big questions. They want you to consider the person of Jesus and the invitation he makes. They and I are convinced that this is true and will stand up to your inquiry. So ask your questions. Take away this book, read it with a friend, ask someone from CICCU to take you to church, investigate it all. Thanks for listening.